160 million years ago, this planet was unrecognizable. Not slightly different. Unrecognizable. The continents were in completely different positions. There were no polar ice caps anywhere. The atmosphere contained 4 times more carbon dioxide than it does today. There were no flowers, no grass, no birds. Not yet. And moving through this alien world were animals so enormous that modern physics still struggles to fully explain how they functioned. Animals whose closest living relatives are not lizards, not crocodiles. Their closest living relatives are sitting in the trees outside your window right now. The real Jurassic, the one that geology and paleontology and chemistry and physics have spent 200 years reconstructing, is a world so strange, so violent, and so extravagantly alive that the movie version looks like a children's cartoon by comparison. And the real story begins not with dinosaurs. It begins with the greatest catastrophe this planet has ever survived. 252 million years ago, the Earth was dying. Not metaphorically, literally dying. In the space of a few tens of thousands of years, a single heartbeat in geological time, 96% of all marine species vanished from the fossil record. 70% of land vertebrates followed. 83% of all insect genera. Forests disappeared from most of the planet's surface. Coral reefs that had been building for hundreds of millions of years dissolved in an acidified ocean and did not recover for 10 million years afterward. We call this the Great Permian Extinction. Paleontologists sometimes call it simply the Great Dying, and that name is earned. Nothing like it had happened before. Nothing like it has happened since. Even the famous extinction that killed the non-avian dinosaurs 66 million years ago, the one everyone knows, the asteroid, the winter, the end of the world, was a minor inconvenience by comparison. A bad Tuesday. The Great Dying was an entirely different category of catastrophe. The cause was volcanism on a scale that is genuinely difficult to hold in your mind. Across what is now Siberia, over roughly 1 million years, something called the Siberian Traps erupted. Not a single volcano, not a chain of volcanoes. An entire volcanic province covering approximately 2 million square kilometers, an area the size of Western Europe, where lava did not pour from scenic conical peaks, but burst from cracks in the Earth's crust in massive horizontal floods, coating the landscape in layer after layer of basalt, thousands of meters deep in places. But the lava itself was not the primary killer. The gases were. Those eruptions pumped staggering volumes of carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and Brent into the atmosphere over hundreds of thousands of years. Global temperatures climbed. Oceans warmed and lost their oxygen. Acid rain stripped vegetation from the land. The ozone layer was damaged so severely that ultraviolet radiation reached the surface at levels lethal to most life. Fossilized plant spores from this period show mass mutations, deformed, twisted structures that only form under extreme ultraviolet bombardment. The planet did not just lose most of its species. It lost the entire architecture of life. The complex, interlocking ecosystems that had been assembling for hundreds of millions of years. And what came after, in the early Triassic, looked were a biological wasteland. This is where the story of dinosaurs begins. But not the way you might expect. The first dinosaurs were not giants. They were not apex predators. They did not dominate the planet. Not immediately. Early Triassic dinosaurs were small, often bipedal creatures competing with dozens of other reptile groups for modest niches in slowly recovering ecosystems. Eoraptor, one of the earliest known dinosaurs from Argentina, living around 230 million years ago, was roughly the size of a large dog. It ran on two legs, weighed about 10 kilograms, and, based on its teeth, ate pretty much anything it could catch or find. That is not the image the word dinosaur conjures. The world of the early and middle Triassic belonged not to dinosaurs, but to other archosaur lineages: atosaurs, phytosaurs, Rauisuchians. Large, well-armed, highly successful predators and herbivores, occupying the ecological roles we later associate with dinosaurs. In the Triassic, dinosaurs were minor players, evolutionary experiments that could very easily have come to nothing. And then the second extinction hit. 201 million years ago, at the boundary between the Triassic and the Jurassic, another wave of mass death swept the planet. Again, volcanism. This time, the culprit was the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, a massive eruption sequence accompanying the breakup of Pangaea and the opening of the Atlantic Ocean. Again, carbon dioxide. Again, warming. Again, extinction. The Rauisuchians died. The atosaurs died. The large amphibians that dominated freshwater ecosystems died. Many marine reptile lineages collapsed. The dinosaurs survived. Nobody knows exactly why. Perhaps a more efficient respiratory system handled low oxygen atmospheres better than their competitors. Perhaps behavioral flexibility. Perhaps geography. The luck of having populations concentrated in regions that suffered less. The fossil record does not give us a clean answer. It gives us only the result. When the dust settled, the dinosaurs found themselves in a world emptied of most of its competition. Ecological niches gaped open like vacancies in a suddenly abandoned city. And over the next few million years, in the earliest Jurassic, dinosaurs began filling those niches with a speed and diversity that stands as one of the most dramatic adaptive radiations in the history of life on Earth. The world was theirs. Every ecological role, every habitat, every continent. If this is the kind of science that genuinely excites you, please subscribe. We make these films for people who still get excited about how the world actually works. And your support is what makes this possible. Thank you. Now, to understand what that world actually was, you need to do something counterintuitive. Forget almost everything you know about modern Earth. Not adjust it. Forget it entirely and start from scratch. Begin with geography. When the earliest dinosaurs were establishing themselves in the Triassic, all of the planet's major land masses were fused into a single supercontinent, Pangaea. One colossal landmass stretching almost from pole to pole, surrounded by a single global ocean called Panthalassa. No Atlantic, no Indian Ocean, no Pacific in any recognizable form. By the middle of the Jurassic, around 160 million years ago, Pangaea had begun to tear itself apart. The northern block, Laurasia, the future North America, Europe and Asia, was separating from the southern block, Gondwana, the future South America, Africa, Antarctica, Australia and India. Between them, a young Atlantic Ocean was opening. At first narrow as the modern Red Sea, widening by centimetres per year, but with consequences measured in millions of years. Animal populations that had previously ranged freely across a single continent found themselves divided by expanding water barriers. Evolution began running different experiments on different fragments of the fracturing supercontinent. Dinosaurs that had been a relatively uniform group at the start of the Jurassic were, by its end, evolving in increasingly isolated worlds. Separate evolutionary theatres producing forms that would never have existed on a unified landmass. But the geography was only the beginning of the strangeness. The Jurassic climate was something no living human has ever experienced, and no climate model of the modern world quite prepares you for. No polar ice caps existed, anywhere. The average global temperature ran roughly 8 to 10 degrees Celsius higher than today. In high latitudes, where Arctic desert exists now, dense conifer forests grew. Polar regions hosted dinosaurs, and not just briefly. They appear to have survived polar night, months of complete darkness, through adaptations we still do not fully understand. Carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere ran between 1,500 and 2,000 parts per million. For context, today, after 2 centuries of industrial civilization, we speak with alarm about levels around 420 parts per million. The Jurassic atmosphere contained 4 to 5 times more carbon dioxide than our already elevated modern atmosphere. The greenhouse effect was powerful, permanent, and planet-wide. The result was biological productivity of an almost incomprehensible scale. But not plant growth that would look familiar. No oaks, no pine forests as we know them, no meadows. What covered the Jurassic landscape was a world of giant tree ferns, enormous horsetails, cycads with feathery palm-like fronds, ginkgo trees in dozens of species spread across the entire planet, and vast conifer forests. And here is one of the most striking facts about the Jurassic world, one that rarely gets the attention it deserves. There were no flowers. Not one. Anywhere on Earth. Flowering plants, angiosperms, which today account for the overwhelming majority of plant species, including every grass, every fruit tree, every crop that feeds humanity, had not yet evolved. No apples, no nuts, no berries, no wheat, rice, or corn. The Jurassic world was a world without fruit in any modern sense. And this single fact reshapes everything we thought we understood about how its largest inhabitants fed themselves. How did an animal weighing 70 tons sustain itself on a diet of ferns and cycads? That question leads somewhere genuinely astonishing. But first, the oceans. Because the Jurassic seas deserve their own reckoning, and what lived in them makes the largest modern marine predators look like something you would keep in a home aquarium. Modern oceans are populated but relatively safe for large animals. Most marine predators hunt fish, squid, sea lions. Something the size of a car in the modern ocean sits comfortably at the top of the food chain with essentially no natural enemies. In the Jurassic Ocean, a car-sized animal was a reasonable meal. Ichthyosaurs had existed for over 100 million years by the Jurassic and had reached extraordinary diversity. Externally, they resembled dolphins, the same streamlined body, the same tail fin, the same large eyes. But they were no more related to dolphins than a shark is related to a tuna. This is convergent evolution at its most elegant. Completely unrelated animals arriving at the same physical solution to the same problem. The largest Jurassic ichthyosaurs, such as Temnodontosaurus, reached 9 meters in length. Their eyes were the largest of any vertebrate known to have existed, up to 25 centimeters in diameter. Eyes that size have one purpose: hunting in low light at significant depth. But ichthyosaurs were not the most alarming residents of the Jurassic Ocean. That distinction belongs to the pliosaurs, and specifically to Leopleurodon, a skull 1.5 meters long, teeth 30 centimeters in length, longer than your forearm. 4 massive flippers that worked not like paddles, but like underwater wings, generating thrust on both the downstroke and the upstroke. The same principle modern engineers use in the most efficient underwater propulsion systems ever designed. A body that paleontologists conservatively estimate at 6 to 10 meters in total length. A popular British documentary in the late 1990s depicted Leopleurodon at 25 meters. Pure invention. Scientists corrected it immediately. But even the real animal, the scientifically defensible animal, was an apex predator of such efficiency that almost nothing in the Jurassic Ocean was safe from it, including, almost certainly, other large marine reptiles. The Jurassic seas also hosted long-necked plesiosaurs hunting fish near the surface, marine crocodiles that had abandoned terrestrial life and evolved fish-like tail fins and smooth skin in place of armor, and ammonites, coiled shell cephalopods in hundreds of species so numerous that their compressed remains form the basic structure of Jurassic limestone across Europe. You can hold a piece of Jurassic rock in your hand, and what you are really holding is the compressed remains of millions of creatures that were alive in that vanished ocean. Now look up, because the Jurassic sky was not empty either, and what flew through it operated on engineering principles that took humanity until the 20th century to properly appreciate. Pterosaurs, flying reptiles, not dinosaurs but closely related, had by the Jurassic been airborne for tens of millions of years. Rhamphorhynchus had a long tail with a diamond-shaped vertical stabilizer at the tip, an aerodynamic solution to the problem of flight stability that aircraft designers would rediscover in the 20th century, and forward-projecting teeth perfectly configured for snatching fish at speed. Dimorphodon had a wingspan of about 1.5 meters, and a head so disproportionately enormous that early reconstructions were dismissed as misidentifications. Pterosaurs were not birds. They were not flying dinosaurs. They were an entirely separate evolutionary lineage, that independently solved the problem of powered, flapping flight, and solved it differently from every other flying vertebrate that has ever existed. The wing membrane was supported by a single, enormously elongated ring finger. 3 completely different evolutionary solutions to the same physical challenge. Pterosaurs, birds, bats, all successful for tens of millions of years, all arriving at flight through completely different architectural decisions. Fossil impressions preserving traces of a hair-like body covering called pycnofibers strongly suggest that pterosaurs were warm-blooded, at least partially. And this makes physiological sense. You cannot sustain the metabolic demands of powered flight without the ability to regulate your own body temperature. Cold-blooded flight is a physiological contradiction beyond very small body sizes. But all of this, the ichthyosaurs, the pliosaurs, the pterosaurs, was the supporting cast. Because the central phenomenon of the Jurassic period, the thing that makes it genuinely unlike any other chapter in the history of life on Earth, was the sauropods. No other group of animals in the history of this planet ever achieved anything like this. Diplodocus, Brachiosaurus, Camarasaurus, Apatosaurus, the animal you probably grew up calling Brontosaurus, whose name has one of the stranger histories in paleontological nomenclature. And later, descendants of Jurassic ancestors, Argentinosaurus, whose complete length may have reached 35 to 40 meters, and whose mass may have approached 80 to 100 metric tons. How is any of that physically possible? This is not a rhetorical question. It is one of the central problems that paleobiology has been wrestling with seriously for the past 40 years. Because sauropod gigantism appears to violate what seem like fundamental physical constraints on terrestrial animals. Think of it this way. The weight of an animal increases with the cube of its linear dimensions. Double the length, 8 times the mass. But the strength of bone increases only with the square of its cross-sectional area. This means that as animals get larger, their bones must become disproportionately thicker just to avoid catastrophic structural failure. The largest modern land mammal, the elephant, already has bones that are nearly solid cylinders, massively dense. An elephant weighs 5 or 6 metric tons. Argentinosaurus weighed roughly 80. Scale an elephant skeleton up to Argentinosaurus size using the same proportions, and the result collapses under its own weight before it takes a single step. So how did sauropods do it? The answer is one of the most elegant pieces of biological engineering ever discovered, and it was hiding in plain sight for over a century before anyone properly understood what they were looking at. Sauropod vertebrae were not solid bone. They were honeycombed with a complex system of air sacs, diverticular of the respiratory system that had invaded the skeleton itself, creating internal cavities throughout the vertebrae and even into the ribs. This is the same structural principle that engineers call a lattice or monocoque architecture. Maximum stiffness at minimum mass. Think of modern aircraft fuselages. A sauropod vertebra that looked enormous from the outside might be hollow for 60% of its volume. The skeleton weighed dramatically less than its external dimensions suggested. But those air sacs were not just structural. They were connected, part of a unified respiratory system. And that respiratory system was not like a reptile's. It was not like a mammal's. It was, in its fundamental architecture, identical to the respiratory system of a modern bird. Birds breathe differently from every other living vertebrate. They do not have simple expanding and contracting lungs. Instead, air moves through their bodies in one direction only, through a system of air sacs that function as bellows, continuously pumping fresh air through the lungs in a single unidirectional flow. Fresh air passes through on both inhalation and exhalation. No dead air, no wasted respiratory volume. Maximum efficiency at every moment. This is why a bar-tailed godwit can fly 11,000 kilometers non-stop from Alaska to New Zealand. This is why birds can function above the Himalayas at altitudes where a mammal loses consciousness within minutes. Sauropods had the same system, and this single fact resolves what had seemed like an impossible metabolic equation. A 70-ton animal with bird-level respiratory efficiency could sustain itself on Jurassic vegetation. The physics work. They work elegantly, but only if the animal was running a high enough metabolic rate to need that efficiency. Which brings us directly to the question that divided paleontology for half a century. Were dinosaurs warm-blooded? For most of the 20th century, all dinosaurs were assumed to be cold-blooded, sluggish, dependent on external heat. The image of a brachiosaurus standing in a swamp, too heavy to support itself on land, barely capable of doing more than eating and breathing, was standard in textbooks and museum displays well into the 1970s. Then Robert Bakker arrived, and he started asking uncomfortable questions. Why do dinosaur limbs point straight down beneath the body, like mammals, instead of sprawling to the sides like lizards? Because straight limbs are the architecture of active, energetic animals. Sprawling limbs are the architecture of animals that spend most of their time resting. Why does dinosaur bone look, under a microscope, like mammal bone? Dense, vascularized, rapidly deposited, the tissue of fast-growing, warm-blooded animals, rather than the slow-growing, poorly vascularized tissue of reptiles. Why do predator-prey ratios in Jurassic fossil assemblages match warm-blooded ecosystems rather than cold-blooded ones? Bakker was initially dismissed as fringe. He is now largely recognized as correct. But modern science reached a more nuanced answer than simply warm-blooded or cold-blooded. And that nuance is actually more interesting than either simple position. Large sauropods were almost certainly what researchers call gigantotherms, not warm-blooded in the mammalian sense. Instead, they maintained stable, elevated body temperature through sheer thermal inertia. A body with a mass of 70 tons simply does not cool down overnight. Physically cannot. It holds heat the way a massive stone building holds heat. The mass itself becomes the insulator. Small, fast, active theropod dinosaurs, the hunters, the runners, the pack animals, were almost certainly genuinely endothermic in the full mammalian sense. Their bone growth rates, their active hunting lifestyles, and ultimately their direct evolutionary relationship to modern birds all point to a high metabolic, self-regulating physiology. Which means the Jurassic world contained animals operating across the full metabolic spectrum simultaneously. A diversity of physiological strategies that has no parallel in the modern world. The giant and the swift, the inertial and the endothermic, sharing the same floodplains, drinking from the same rivers, dying at the teeth of the same predators. And now, the hunters. Here is something that the film industry has systematically gotten wrong for 30 years and continues to get wrong. The predator that everyone associates with the phrase "age of dinosaurs," the one that roared on 1,000 cinema screens, is not a Jurassic animal. Tyrannosaurus rex lived in the late Cretaceous, roughly 68 to 66 million years ago. It was separated from Diplodocus by a greater span of time than we are separated from T-Rex. If you placed a Tyrannosaurus in the Jurassic, it would be as chronologically out of place as a modern elephant in ancient Rome. The apex predator of the Jurassic was Allosaurus, and it deserves the respect that is usually redirected to its more famous Cretaceous successor. Allosaurus reached 8 to 9 meters in length and weighed between 1.5 and 2 metric tons. Bipedal, as all theropods were, a massive tail providing counterbalance, and forelimbs, here is the critical difference from Tyrannosaurus, that were powerful and fully developed, bearing 3 claws each reaching 15 to 20 centimeters. These arms were not vestigial ornaments, they were weapons. The skull of Allosaurus tells a story that took paleontologists decades to properly read. The jaws were not designed for crushing, bone-shattering bite force. The teeth were laterally flattened, blade-like, with serrated edges. The skull itself was relatively thin-walled and light for its size. Biomechanical analysis has led several researchers to propose what they call the hatchet strategy. Allosaurus would drive its upper jaw downward into prey, with the full weight of the head and neck behind it, inflicting massive slashing wounds rather than holding prey in a bone-crushing grip. Against a 40-ton sauropod, a crushing bite is irrelevant. You cannot hold something that outweighs you by a factor of 20, but you can open wounds that will not close. You can follow your prey until it weakens and falls. Predation as a war of attrition, patient, strategic, and deeply unsettling to contemplate. Whether Allosaurus hunted alone or in groups remains one of the most fiercely debated questions in Jurassic paleontology. The Cleveland Lloyd Dinosaur Quarry in Utah contains the remains of at least 46 individual Allosaurus specimens concentrated in a single location. 46. What drew them there in such numbers? A natural trap? A mud seep, a tar pocket, where prey became mired and individual Allosaurus arrived from miles around, drawn by the smell? Or something more organized? A social hunting aggregation, a coordinated pack? The answer matters. Pack hunting Allosaurus and solitary Allosaurus represent 2 fundamentally different versions of the Jurassic ecosystem. We still do not know which version is correct. And that uncertainty, that honest, productive uncertainty, is what makes Jurassic paleontology one of the most alive fields in all of natural science. Now, the revolution that most profoundly transformed how we understand Jurassic predators had nothing to do with hunting strategies or skull mechanics. It had to do with feathers. In 1961, workers in limestone quarries near Solnhofen in Bavaria uncovered a fossil impression that would become one of the most famous objects in the history of science. A creature the size of a crow, preserved in fine-grained lithographic limestone with photographic precision. The skeleton was unmistakably reptilian, a long bony tail, toothed jaws, 3 clawed fingers on each wing. But surrounding it, preserved with extraordinary clarity, were feathers. True, asymmetric, aerodynamically functional feathers, structurally indistinguishable from the feathers of any modern bird. Archaeopteryx, 150 million years old. For more than a century after Archaeopteryx, the conventional wisdom held that feathers were a bird thing, a special innovation that appeared only in the direct ancestors of modern birds and nowhere else in the dinosaur family tree. Then the Chinese fossils arrived, and everything changed. In the late 1990s, the Yishen Formation in Liaoning Province began producing fossils that rewrote the textbooks. One after another, from fine-grained sedimentary rock, emerged non-avian dinosaurs with unmistakable feather impressions. Sinosauropteryx, Caudipteryx, Microraptor, a 4-winged dinosaur with aerodynamic feathers on both its arms and its legs, gliding or flying using 4 lifting surfaces simultaneously. These were not birds. These were ground-dwelling and tree-climbing predators. And they had feathers. The conclusion was inescapable. Feathers did not evolve in birds. Feathers evolved in dinosaurs. The earliest feathers were almost certainly simple filamentous structures, analogous to mammalian hair, serving primarily for insulation. Only later did certain lineages develop the complex, asymmetric feathers used for flight. This means feathered bodies were the norm, not the exception, among theropod dinosaurs. Allosaurus almost certainly bore some kind of filamentous body covering, not flight feathers, but something. Some structural remnant of an adaptation that was already ancient by the time it stalked the floodplains of late Jurassic North America. And if feathers, then colour. Because this is where the story takes a turn that the film industry has never fully reckoned with. In 2010, a research team applied a new analytical technique to fossilized feathers, the study of melanosomes, microscopic pigment-containing organelles that preserve in fossils. Their shape directly predicts the color of pigment they contain, the same way melanosomes in modern bird feathers predict color with high reliability. Sinosauropteryx was reddish-brown, with white and chestnut rings on its tail. Microraptor was iridescent blue-black, with the same metallic sheen as a modern raven's wing. Caudipteryx had elaborate patterned tail feathers that would look at home on a bird of paradise. Now consider what this implies about perception. Dinosaurs had color vision superior to our own. The ancestral vertebrate eye was tetrachromatic, sensitive to 4 color channels, including ultraviolet. Mammals lost 2 of those channels during their long Mesozoic night as small, nocturnal, rodent-like creatures hiding from dinosaurs. Birds retained the full 4-channel system. And since birds descended from theropod dinosaurs, it is virtually certain that theropod dinosaurs saw the world in 4 colors, including ultraviolet wavelengths completely invisible to us. A world seen in 4 colors is a fundamentally different world from the one we inhabit. Patterns invisible to us were vivid to a dinosaur. Signals we cannot detect, in plumage, in skin, in territorial displays, were broadcasting continuously to every animal in the vicinity. The Jurassic world was not the grey-green landscape of Hollywood imagination. It was a chromatic explosion, a world of signals and displays and visual communication as rich and complex as anything in a modern tropical rainforest. Every encounter between dinosaurs, between rivals, between mates, between parent and offspring, was conducted in a visual language we literally cannot see. Which means their social lives were far richer than anything the traditional image allowed. And to understand just how rich, we need to spend some time with an animal that almost nobody talks about when they talk about the Jurassic. An animal that was, in many ways, the most sophisticated creature in the entire Morrison ecosystem. Stegosaurus. The plated dinosaur has suffered more from its reputation than almost any other animal in the fossil record. For over a century, it was held up as the textbook example of dinosaur stupidity. Its brain famously described as walnut-sized, its neural processing so inadequate that early researchers proposed it must have had a second brain in its hips to help manage its hind legs. The second brain hypothesis was quietly abandoned decades ago when closer examination revealed the hip cavity in question was almost certainly a glycogen body, a structure found in modern birds that stores energy for the spinal cord. Not a second brain, not even close. But the reputation stuck, and it obscured something genuinely interesting. Stegosaurus was one of the most specialized large animals the Jurassic produced. Those iconic plates running along its back, 17 of them in the best preserved specimens alternating in 2 staggered rows, were not armor. This was understood relatively recently, and the revision matters enormously. The plates were too thin, too poorly positioned and too vulnerable to serve any meaningful defensive purpose. An Allosaurus that grabbed a Stegosaurus by the plates would have done significant damage with minimal effort. So what were they? The plates were extensively vascularized, threaded through with blood vessels in a pattern that strongly suggests thermoregulatory function. By orienting the plates toward or away from the sun, a Stegosaurus could potentially absorb or radiate heat with considerable efficiency, maintaining body temperature across the considerable daily temperature swings of a Jurassic semi-arid environment. Think of them as a sophisticated biological solar panel and radiator system combined. Passive climate control built into the animal's silhouette. But thermoregulation alone does not fully explain the plates, because the plates varied significantly between individuals. Some were taller, some were wider, some showed evidence of rich surface coloration based on their vascular structure. And variation in display structures between individuals of the same species almost always means one thing in biology: sexual selection. The plates were almost certainly used for display, for species recognition, for mate attraction, for dominance signaling between competing individuals. A Stegosaurus with large, richly colored, prominently oriented plates was broadcasting information continuously to every other Stegosaurus within visual range. Information about health, about genetic quality, about competitive status. Stegosaurus was not a slow, stupid, walking salad bar. It was a visually sophisticated social animal conducting complex intraspecific communication through structures we spent a century misidentifying as armor. And its tail was a weapon of genuine effectiveness. The thagomizer, the cluster of 4 large bony spikes at the end of the Stegosaurus tail, a name coined in a Gary Larson Far Side cartoon in 1982 and subsequently adopted by actual paleontologists with evident appreciation for the joke, could deliver blows of extraordinary force. Biomechanical modelling suggests the tail could swing at speeds that would drive those spikes through the flank of an Allosaurus with bone-penetrating impact. Several Allosaurus specimens have been found with puncture wounds in their vertebrae and hip bones that match the dimensions and spacing of Stegosaurus tail spikes precisely. We have the weapon. We have the wounds. We have the perpetrator. This is as close to witnessing a Jurassic confrontation as the fossil record allows us to get. The Morrison Formation, in fact, reads like a crime scene when you know what you are looking for. It is not just the Stegosaurus spikes in Allosaurus bones. A Diplodocus tail vertebra has been found bearing the bite marks of a large theropod, the spacing and dimensions consistent with Allosaurus teeth, with bone remodeling around the wound indicating the animal survived the attack and lived for some time afterward. A Camarasaurus specimen shows healed bite marks on its shoulder blade. A juvenile Apatosaurus skeleton was found with cut marks on its bones, suggesting it was butchered. Not by Allosaurus, but by a smaller theropod that got to the carcass after the initial kill. The Morrison Formation is not a museum display. It is a record of violence and survival, and opportunism and ecological complexity that becomes more legible every decade as analytical techniques improve and new specimens emerge from the rock. And the techniques themselves have undergone a revolution that deserves a moment of attention, not as a dry methodological digression, but as a genuine story of how science learns to ask better questions. For most of the 20th century, paleontology was primarily a morphological science. You found bones. You described their shape. You compared that shape to other bones. You drew conclusions about evolutionary relationships and ecological roles from the geometry of what you could see and measure. That science was extraordinarily productive. It gave us everything we know about dinosaur anatomy, locomotion, and diversity. It was not wrong. But it was incomplete in ways that only became apparent when new tools arrived. Isotope geochemistry changed everything. Oxygen isotope ratios preserved in tooth enamel record the temperature of the water an animal drank during the period when those teeth were forming, which means a single tooth can tell you not just what species the animal was, but approximately what climate it lived in, and in some cases, whether it migrated seasonally, because migrating animals drink water from different regions with different isotopic signatures, and those signatures are recorded permanently in the enamel as the tooth develops. Strontium isotope ratios in bone record the geology of the region where an animal spent most of its life, because strontium from local rocks enters the food chain through plants and water and is incorporated into bone tissue. Compare the strontium signature in a dinosaur's bone to the geological strontium signatures of different regions, and you can sometimes determine where the animal grew up, even if its skeleton was found hundreds of kilometers away. Carbon isotope ratios reveal diet. Nitrogen isotope ratios reveal trophic level, where in the food web an animal fed. Trace element concentrations in bone reveal growth rate and metabolic intensity in ways that complement and extend what bone histology alone can show. From a single, well-preserved dinosaur tooth or bone fragment, A modern isotope geochemist can extract a biography. Not a complete biography, not a novel, but a set of facts about a specific individual's life history, its climate, its diet, its migration patterns, its growth trajectory, that would have been completely inaccessible to paleontology even 40 years ago. This is why the new dinosaurs emerging from current research look so different from the dinosaurs of the 1960s. Not because the bones are different, because the questions we are able to ask about those bones have become incomparably more sophisticated. The animals have not changed. Our ability to read them has. And that reading is still very much in progress. Consider what we still do not know about the Morrison Formation alone, setting aside every other Jurassic deposit on every other continent. We do not know with certainty whether any Morrison sauropod was capable of rearing on its hind legs. The physics suggest it was possible for some species, catastrophic for others. We do not know the full range of vocalizations produced by any Jurassic dinosaur. We do not know whether Jurassic dinosaurs of different species interacted socially in any sustained way, or whether different species at a shared water source simply tolerated each other's presence, with the indifference of large animals at a modern African waterhole. We do not know the full extent of color variation within any Jurassic species, or whether that variation changed seasonally, or with age, or with health status. We do not know what Jurassic nights sounded like, what the smell of a Morrison floodplain was after rain. Whether sauropods made sounds during feeding, during herd movement, during mating, or whether their primary communication was infrasonic, below the range of any modern recording equipment that would have existed even if we could somehow deploy it in the late Jurassic. These are not failures of paleontology. They are the honest acknowledgement of what the fossil record can and cannot preserve. Bone survives. Soft tissue rarely survives. Behavior almost never survives, except in the indirect evidence of trackways, bite marks, healed wounds, and the rare, exceptional preservation sites that give us feather impressions or skin texture or the outline of a crest. Every answer the Morrison Formation gives us comes wrapped in a dozen new questions. Every new analytical technique that resolves one uncertainty reveals three more uncertainties that the previous technique was not sensitive enough to detect. That is not frustrating. That is science doing exactly what science is supposed to do. Approaching the truth asymptotically, getting closer with each generation of researchers and each generation of tools, but never quite arriving. Because the closer you get, the more detail you can resolve, and the more detail you can resolve, the more you realize how much detail there is still to resolve. The Jurassic is not a solved problem. It is not a completed chapter. It is a research frontier that is currently more active, more productive, and more surprising than at any previous point in the history of paleontology. In the past decade alone, one new dinosaur species described approximately every week, most from China, Argentina, Morocco, and regions that were paleontologically unexplored a single generation ago. Each new species adds a data point to our picture of Jurassic diversity. Some of those data points fit comfortably into the existing picture. Some of them force the picture to be redrawn entirely. The titanosaur, Patagotitan miorum, described in 2017 from Argentina, required the construction of a special display mount at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, because no existing gallery was large enough to contain it. The animal's femur alone, a single thigh bone, is 2.4 meters long. To put that in terms you can feel rather than just read, that femur is taller than most professional basketball players. This animal was alive in the Cretaceous, descended from Jurassic sauropod ancestors, and it was real. Not a movie, not an illustration. Real bone, real tissue, real animal that breathed and fed and moved through a real landscape that is now the Patagonian desert of southern Argentina. That reality, the sheer, physical, undeniable reality of these animals, is something that familiarity has made it easy to forget. We grow up with dinosaurs. We see them in museums before we can read. We watch them on screens from early childhood. And somewhere in that process of familiarization, the genuine strangeness of them gets domesticated. They become known. They become expected. They become, in the worst case, boring. They are not boring. They are the most dramatic evidence available to us that the world we inhabit is not the world. It is one world, one chapter in a book that has been running for 4 billion years and shows no signs of ending. The Jurassic was another chapter, stranger than ours, louder than ours, vaster than ours in the scale of its living things. And it was as real as this moment, as concrete as the chair you are sitting in, as present once as the ground beneath your feet. The rock remembers. Slowly, reluctantly, one fragment at a time, it gives back what it holds. And what it holds is enough, more than enough, to make the hair stand up on the back of your neck, if you let it. Which means their social lives were far richer than anything the traditional image allowed. And the evidence for social complexity has been accumulating steadily for decades. In 1988, Jack Horner described a nesting site in Montana called Egg Mountain, nesting grounds of the hadrosaur Maiasaura. But not just nests. Nests with juveniles, whose teeth showed weeks of wear from feeding in the nest. Bones not yet developed enough for independent locomotion. Plant food scattered around the nesting sites. Parents returned with food, repeatedly, over weeks. This is brooding behavior, the same fundamental parental strategy used by modern birds. And it demolished the image of dinosaurs as egg-laying, immediately abandoning machines of pure instinct. Sauropod trackways have been found showing juveniles in the center of the herd and adults around the perimeter, the classic defensive formation of modern herd animals protecting young. They migrated, in herds, like elephants, like bison, like every large social mammal we know today. And the sound of those herds moving? This is where the story takes its most unexpected turn. The roar of Tyrannosaurus from 1993, that iconic sound constructed by sound designers from a blend of elephant, tiger, and alligator, has become one of the most culturally embedded sounds in modern cinema. It is almost certainly wrong. Completely and fundamentally wrong. The roar of mammals is produced by vocal cords in the larynx. Dinosaurs
based on their close relationship to modern birds and crocodiles, almost certainly produced sound differently, through resonant chambers and closed-mouth vocalizations, generating low-frequency booming and infrasound vibrations rather than open-mouthed roaring. In 2019, a beautifully preserved ankylosaur specimen was described with partial soft tissue structures in the laryngeal region. The architecture of those tissues matched closed-mouth resonance systems, not open-mouthed roaring.
Crocodiles, the closest living archosaur relatives of dinosaurs, use this strategy. So do many birds. The common ancestor of both almost certainly did as well. The Jurassic world probably did not roar. It hummed. It boomed. It broadcast low-frequency vibrations through the ground and the air simultaneously. Sounds you would feel in your chest before you heard them with your ears. A herd of sauropods communicating through infrasound would have been detectable kilometers away, not by the ear, but by the body. Now, the question that the entire film industry built its reputation on, the question that 1993 made every child ask their science teacher: can we bring them back? In Jurassic Park, scientists recover dinosaur DNA from blood preserved inside a mosquito trapped in amber millions of years ago. The idea is beautiful. It is elegant. It is just plausible enough to feel scientific. And it is impossible. DNA is a profoundly unstable molecule. Under ideal conditions, dry, cold, dark, oxygen-free, the half-life of DNA is approximately 520 years. That means that within 520 years, half of the chemical bonds in any DNA sample will have broken. Within another 520 years, half of the remaining half. The mathematics are unforgiving and do not negotiate. The theoretical maximum age of recoverable, readable DNA is approximately 6.8 million years, and that would require near-perfect permafrost preservation. The youngest non-avian dinosaurs died 66 million years ago. That is nearly 10 times beyond the absolute theoretical limit. Dinosaur DNA does not exist anywhere on Earth. Not in amber, not in bone, not in any substrate. It is gone. Irreversibly and completely gone. What about proteins? In 2017, Mary Schweitzer announced the identification of collagen in a Brachylophosaurus bone approximately 80 million years old. This remains scientifically controversial. But even if genuine ancient protein fragments exist, they are not a blueprint. You cannot reconstruct an organism from collagen fragments any more than you can reconstruct a novel from 3 letters torn from a page. Bringing dinosaurs back in the Jurassic Park sense is not a matter of technological progress. It is a fundamental impossibility. No amount of computing power changes the fact that the information no longer exists. And yet, here is the turn that the film industry somehow missed entirely, despite it being arguably more astonishing than any science fiction premise. Dinosaurs are not extinct. They are in the tree outside your window. Birds are dinosaurs. Not descendants of dinosaurs, not relatives of dinosaurs. Birds are a clade of theropod dinosaurs,
specifically the avialans, that survived the end Cretaceous extinction and are alive and extraordinarily successful today. A chicken is a dinosaur. An ostrich is a dinosaur. The hummingbird at your garden feeder is a dinosaur, executing a behavioral display that has been refining itself for 150 million years. This is not poetic metaphor. This is strict biological classification. And this single fact, once it settles fully into your understanding, changes the emotional texture of every bird you will ever see for the rest of your life. But the story does not end with birds, because the Jurassic bequeathed its legacy not just forward into the Cretaceous and then into the modern world through birds. It bequeathed it sideways, into every other lineage that survived alongside the dinosaurs. And one of those lineages is the reason this film exists at all. During the height of the Jurassic, while Allosaurus hunted Diplodocus across the Morrison floodplains, something very small was moving through the undergrowth beneath their feet. Our ancestors. The earliest mammals had already been evolving for 50 million years by the late Jurassic. They were small, mostly the size of modern mice or rats, mostly nocturnal, mostly insectivorous, warm-blooded, lactating, increasingly sophisticated in their processing of a world that they navigated almost entirely in darkness. Because darkness was the only place where a small mammal could survive in a world owned by dinosaurs. Here is the thing that stops you cold when you truly consider it. The human capacity for acute hearing evolved in the Jurassic. The human ability to see in low light conditions evolved in the Jurassic. The enlarged mammalian brain, relative to body size, dramatically larger than any reptile brain, began its long expansion in the Jurassic, driven by the demands of navigating complex three-dimensional environments in the dark while avoiding animals that could swallow you without noticing. The fear that built our brains was the shadow of a sauropod. Everything you are, cognitively, begins in those dark Jurassic nights. The intelligence that eventually allowed our ancestors to build cities and write symphonies and launch spacecraft was forged in the terror of being small and fragile in a world of giants. The dinosaurs did not just share the planet with our ancestors. They shaped them. They were the selective pressure that made us. For 80 million years in the Jurassic and Cretaceous combined, the mammals waited, hiding, evolving, getting slightly smarter with each generation, because in their world, slightly smarter meant the difference between surviving the night and not surviving it. That patience paid off, but the payment required the end of the dinosaurs first. Now consider what the Morrison Formation actually is, because this rock formation is one of the most scientifically productive deposits in the history of paleontology, and it deserves to be understood as something more than a list of species names. It is a layer of sedimentary rock stretching across 14 American states: Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, Montana, New Mexico, and beyond, deposited between approximately 155 and 148 million years ago. From above, it covers an area larger than the entire Western European continent. It is, in effect,
a single enormous snapshot of one Jurassic ecosystem, preserved in sandstone and mudstone and siltstone, slowly being exposed by erosion, slowly being read by paleontology. The environment it describes was not the lush tropical jungle of popular imagination. Parts of it were semi-arid, seasonal floodplains crossed by rivers that ran full during wet seasons and shrank to disconnected pools during drought. Think of the modern Serengeti, scaled up by geological time. Vast open landscapes interrupted by river corridors lined with conifers and tree ferns, punctuated by permanent water sources around which life concentrated with extraordinary density. And the growth rates of the animals that lived there were something that no one anticipated until bone histology, the microscopic study of bone tissue, revealed annual growth rings in dinosaur bones, like tree rings, allowing paleontologists to reconstruct an individual animal's complete growth history from a single bone fragment. What they found changed everything. A young Apatosaurus added mass at a rate comparable to a modern blue whale, arguably the fastest growth rate of any land animal in Earth's history. An individual Diplodocus reached its full adult size within perhaps 15 to 20 years, not the century of slow reptilian growth that cold-blooded models would predict. 15 to 20 years from hatching to 30 tons.
This means the ecosystem had to support not just the giants we typically imagine, but a constant churning supply of large juveniles at every stage of growth. Animals the size of cows, then horses, then elephants, then something with no modern equivalent, all simultaneously competing for Jurassic vegetation, all growing toward an adult size that dwarfed everything that had ever walked the land before them. And when they ate, consider the scale of that consumption. A single adult Brachiosaurus required, by current estimates, somewhere between 400 and 800 kilograms of plant material per day. Every day. Every single day of an adult life that may have spanned several decades. Multiply that by the density of sauropods that trackways and bone beds suggest populated Morrison-equivalent environments, and you arrive at a level of herbivory that would have shaped every aspect of the Jurassic landscape, not passively as inhabitants, but actively as engineers. Sauropods determined what the Jurassic world looked like, by selectively consuming certain plants and ignoring others, by trampling vegetation with feet the size of oil drums, by depositing enormous quantities of nutrient-rich waste across the landscape, by dying and providing massive carcass resources that fed scavengers and decomposers for months at a time. The distribution of plant species, the structure of Jurassic forests, the chemistry of Jurassic soils, all of it bore the marks of sauropod occupation as clearly as the modern African savanna bears the marks of elephants. When sauropods eventually went extinct, the landscapes they had shaped for over 100 million years changed in response. This is co-evolution at the ecosystem level, a feedback loop between the largest animals ever to walk the land and the vegetation they depended upon, each shaping the other across geological time.
And when one of those giants died, the full weight of that event rippled through the ecosystem in ways that took months to resolve. A carcass of 70 tons does not disappear quickly.
The Howe Quarry in Wyoming, excavated in the 1930s by the American Museum of Natural History, contained approximately 4,000 bones extracted from a single quarry face over several field seasons. Diplodocus, Camarasaurus, Brachiosaurus, Allosaurus, all mixed together in what appears to have been a catastrophic drought concentration. Animals gathering around the last water source as it shrank, dying as it disappeared. Layer upon layer of death recorded in a few cubic meters of rock. 4,000 bones from a single quarry face in a single drought event. Stand in front of that number for a moment. Those were not fossils. They were animals. They had come from across the landscape, following diminishing water, arriving at the last pool to find it already crowded with others doing the same. They waited. The water dropped. They died. And they lay there together in the baking Jurassic heat until sediment covered them and 150 million years passed, and a team of scientists with brushes and dental picks began to read what the rock had been holding in silence all that time. That is what the Jurassic actually was. Not a series of individual spectacular animals posed against painted backgrounds. An ecosystem. A community. A web of interdependencies that lived and died together, was swallowed by geological time and is now, slowly, surrendering itself back to us. One bone at a time, one field season at a time, one argument about neck posture at a time. The Jurassic ended around 145 million years ago. Not in fire, not in impact. The transition from Jurassic to Cretaceous was gradual. Continental drift, sea level change, slow climate shifts that altered habitats faster than some lineages could adapt.
Allosaurus disappears from the fossil record at or near this boundary. Stegosaurus vanishes at approximately the same time. The iconic sauropods of the Morrison Formation do not appear in early Cretaceous deposits. New groups diversified to replace them. The titanosaur sauropods, which would eventually produce animals even larger than their Jurassic predecessors, began their ascent. The ancestors of Tyrannosaurus and Velociraptor were at this moment small, feathered, and completely unremarkable. Nothing in their early Cretaceous appearance suggested what they would eventually become. The transition was a handoff. The Jurassic passed its inheritance, its ecosystems, its evolutionary innovations, its surviving lineages, forward into the Cretaceous, which built upon it for another 80 million years, before the asteroid ended everything except the birds. And from the birds, the inheritance continues. In every migration pattern of a modern songbird, the same instinct that moved sauropod herds across Jurassic floodplains. In every brooding hen sitting motionless on a nest, the same behavioral logic that Maiasaura used in Montana 77 million years ago. In every territorial display of a peacock, a chromatic signal in a visual language 400 million years in the making, broadcasting on frequencies we cannot see. 160 million years ago, an Allosaurus stood on the bank of a river in what is now Utah and watched a herd of Diplodocus crossing a ford. The atmosphere was hotter. The air was denser with carbon dioxide. The forest around it contained not a single flower. The sky above carried pterosaurs, not birds. But the Allosaurus breathed. It hunted.
It communicated through color and sound, in a language richer than anything our three-color vision can perceive. It moved through a social world that no museum diorama has ever come close to capturing.
And in the dark undergrowth at the river's edge, something small and warm-blooded and frightened pressed itself flat against the ground and waited for the giants to pass. That small, frightened animal was us. Not us yet, but the beginning of us. The raw material. The creature that fear would spend the next 160 million years turning into something capable of standing in a museum, looking at the skeleton of a diplodocus and feeling what exactly? Vertigo. The dizziness of deep time. The sudden, visceral understanding that this planet was fully, extravagantly, magnificently alive long before anything resembling us arrived. And that the line connecting that world to this one runs unbroken through every bird that has ever sung outside a human window. The Jurassic did not end. It became us.